ICD-11, International Classification of Disease, 11th edition. An overview and critical appraisal. First of all, why do we classify? It appears to be a very philosophical question. This scene is familiar. It has made a lot of difference. So it is to reduce the cognitive dissonance and anxiety. Otherwise, the chaotic world, people will be highly anxious. If you put it in classes which you can decipher easily and make the information processing easier, and life is made more comfortable. Whether it is starting from anatomy to behavior science, classification becomes a need for the human mind searching for meaning and reducing the cognitive dissonance. This man is famous, has made the life of botanist all the more difficult, but he made the classification of plants in a binomial classification way back in 1758 rather easy. So classification can be categorical or dimensional. Well, in 2010, Kerala board examination, 10th examination, more than 8 lakh candidates appeared and each wrote 10 subjects. The result came as either passed or failed. 10 lakhs divided into 2 categories. Again, a finer distinction can be made as distinction first class, second class, third class, and failed. This is categorization. So advantages of classification by categorical system, they are very familiar. Passed or failed, distinction or not, a rank or no rank. Easy to understand and remember. It's useful for treatment when it comes to medical. It's more acceptable. Whereas all the 10 lakh of candidates have 12 papers. And marks for each paper will make the whole data. This is called a dimensional. Very difficult for a brain to comprehend all these dimensions. But there are certain advantages for dimensional system. They convey more information, right? A person scoring 0 marks for mathematics, but 99 for languages and all gives definitely a different clinical picture. It's more flexible. Finer distinctions are possible and they do not impose artificial boundaries as for passed or failed. But in difficult cases, we make categories with spectrum dimension. So classifications are basically for communication. It's a shorthand notation of what I have. For example, if I make a diagnosis of myocardial infarction, 2 words, myocardial infarction, carries a lot of information which can be generally applied to a group of patients. It has got clinical utility also. So classification has 3 important goals. One is reliability. It must be measured if by another person should also come to a same conclusion. Validity. You should measure what you intend to measure. If I make a diagnosis of schizophrenia and a person sitting in United States thinks that it is a dissociation disorder, it serves no purpose. It should be clinically useful. So classification in psychiatry is like classifying clouds. Clouds by their shape. They have fuzzy boundaries, tend to merge imperceptibly and drift, being carried by invisible currents. Observation, measurement of their movement to an extent predicts the weather, though yet the inner physical and chemical structure of the clouds are hidden to naked eyes. And sometimes schizophrenia merges with bipolar, sometimes bipolar differs from depressive disorder. It's like clouds. So, like clouds, they tend to overlap. DSM stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. That is a system of classification by American Psychiatric Association, and ICD is by WHO. They are atheoretical, meaning there is no underlying theory for classification. It's only the cluster of symptoms and signs. Let us imagine a hypothetical situation where a person passes more urine. We call it as polyuria. So symptom-based classification is a mild polyuria, moderate polyuria, and severe polyuria. Specifiers are with or without weight loss, with or without insomnia, with or without anxiety. And if you do all the genetic analysis and all on those polyuria, probably you will end up nowhere. Ideally, it must be based on etiopathological classifications like endocrine, diabetes insipidus, renal, chronic renal failure, drugs, metabolic, and psychological. So far, the psychiatry has not reached that etiologically based classification. Still, we are forced to define psychiatric disorders based on clusters of signs and symptoms, based on conversation. And it is very difficult to map the diagnosis to genes, particular brain circuits, and basic behavior mechanisms. It's a challenging task to define and classify mental disorders because brain is the most complex thing in the whole universe. So diagnostic category based on clinical consensus, which we do in bedside, fail to align with the data emerging from the clinical genes, particularly brain circuits, basic behavior mechanisms, and all. So diseases are having characteristic clinical manifestation, characteristic pathology, underlying causes, reduced biological fitness make one disease. In psychiatry, we are still struggling with the nosological status of brain and mind disorders. Brain is a complex 1.5 kilogram jelly with billions of neurons, and each neuron making 1,000 to 10,000 connections, and all the behaviors resting in neural network. Its normality and pathology is very difficult to decipher because it is always in a constant dynamic flux with the environment. But we have to be pragmatic. Robinson Goose said making a diagnosis has at least 5 components. In psychiatry, there must be a clinical description in the absence of etiopathologic laboratory studies. We should be able to delineate it from other disorders. We should follow up and do a family studies. At least these 5 components must be made to make a diagnosis of psychiatry in psychiatry to become meaningful. And the prognosis must also. That is why no psychiatric diagnosis can be made cross-sectionally. It is cross-sectional as well as longitudinal, which may ultimately it may rest. We believe it may rest on a pathology. Follow-up to psychiatrist is what postmortem is to the physician. the Kendler, he says there must be some diagnosis, must have some antecedent validators, concurrent validators like psychological tests, because if I make a diagnosis of schizophrenia, it must have some psychological test to validate those things. And predictive validators, if I make a diagnosis of bipolar, well, it must have some predictive characteristics, response to treatment, duration and all. Andreasen, D.D., who was editor of American Journal of Psychiatry and president of American Psychiatric Association, she said it must be constantly validated by molecular genetics, neurochemistry, neuroanatomy, neurophysiology, and cognitive neurosciences. So it's an ongoing exercise where we purify, refine, re-refine our diagnosis based on the clinical, the laboratory evidence. Reliability, well, when I was a student, way back in early 80s, when my professor made a diagnosis of schizophrenia, there were no anchor points. You do not know how to. We put ourselves in his position and try to feel what could have been in his idea, in his mind when he make a diagnosis of schizophrenia. All through these 2 years and 2 months, we were given that exercises, and finally we come with a diagnosis. There is no criteria. So that was an era when there was no criteria, and DSM-3, DSM stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, third revision, made a revolution in psychiatric classification because it said that for a diagnosis of schizophrenia, these are the things which are needed. This much duration, the absence of those. So people started agreeing as to a person sitting in Trivandrum, Ulambara, also a person sitting in Mayo Clinic will come to a agreement. We call it as reliability. With the introduction of DSM-3, the reliability went up. But the ultimate use is clinically it must be useful. Not only for the clinician, for the patients, lawmakers, for persons who reimburse, for health workers, for JPHN, policy makers, everyone it must be useful. So clinical utility implies the etiology of disorders. If you make a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, it somehow gives a feel about the etiology of the disorder. Predicts their course and prognosis. To some extent, it will determine the treatment. An efficient means of communication and defines, hopefully, homogeneous group of patients for treatment or research. Can be used by the majority, not by the academicians. It must be user-friendly. So classification psychiatry ultimately should be based on etiology, but it is very complex. But till date, the diagnosis is based on categories, which is not the situation in reality. The thresholds are artificially, like for example, schizophrenia has 1 month duration, 6 months duration. Depression should have at 7, 5 out of 11. It's all arbitrary. Ideally, categories must be mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. The diagnosis carry all the diagnoses, but one diagnosis should not overlap with the other. Meaning, there must be zones of rarity between disorders. But in real situation, it is not the situation. There is a high comorbidity. So, ICD of WHO. It is used for clinical, epidemiological, administrative purpose and implementation of health policies. It's a global perspective. The third world countries, the treatment gap, the research gap, the person who are suffering by way of terrorism, torture, atrocities against women, children are probably a global perspective which WHO holds. Taking the history, It was in 1948 WHO assumed the responsibility of classification. The series of classifications occurred, and ICD-10 was in 1994. In 10 years' time was the period allocated for a revision, but after 25 years, 1/4 of a century, new classification came. In June 2018, ICD version preparation implementation, member states including translations were released. May 2019, this month. It will be presented at the 72nd World Health Assembly for endorsement by member state. Member state will begin reporting data using ICD-11. Coming to mental disorders in ICD, morbidity and mortality statistics, that's a full, it has been changed. The chapter initially in ICD-10 was chapter 5, now it has moved to chapter 6. ICD is for classification of whole disorders, not for mental disorders, and chapter 6 deals with mental, behavior or neurodevelopmental disorders. There are 161 4-character alphanumeric characters. Code ranges from, it starts from 6A00, 6B, 6C, 6D, 6E, and ends with 6E, 8Z. This is the book PGs are afraid of. Why change ICD-10? To improve the classification without losing what has been gained. Maintain the basic purpose while increasing the diversity of stakeholders. Most important is the clinical utility. The core concept guiding 11th revision of ICD is clinical utility. It must be used by the maximum number of people, whether literate, illiterate, researcher, administrator, reimbursement, lawmaker. It must be convenient and informative for them. There is a standard format for ICD-11. There will be a category name. A brief description carrying 100 to 125 words. A very brief essay. Like schizophrenia. Name is schizophrenia. There is a summary statement that it develops during this period. The patient has delusions, hallucinations. That will be described in 100 to 125 words. Certain names are included in this thing and some are not. For example, schizotypal, pseudoneurotic, such things are not given. There are essential or core criteria for this disorder. That is mandatory. The boundary with normality or the threshold must be defined, specifying those aspects of the disorder which are indicative of its pathological disorder. That is how they distinguish it from normals. And the boundary with other disorders, differential diagnosis, are explicitly stated. And other course features, developmental presentation, are also presented. Exclusions are uncomplicated bereavement and acute stress reaction. Because acute stress disorder or reaction, very difficult to distinguish it from a normal behavior. And moreover, PTSD also has no limit for the duration. It contains even the acute stress disorder. And uncomplicated bereavement is not a mental disorder. Coded elsewhere are sleep-wake disorders, sexual dysfunction, gender incongruence, because they are not considered as purely mental. The distinction between the urology and psychiatry are arbitrary and bound to blur the reality in. So they are put elsewhere. So the list of blocks from A to E. Don't be panicky. So coding is alphanumeric. You know what is alphanumeric? 4 characteristics. 6 stands for the chapter 6. ICD 6 means chapter 6. Mental, neurobehavior and developmental disorders. 820 is schizophrenia. Single episode. Multiple episode carries 0.1. Symptomatic. Schizophrenia, first episode, currently symptomatic. So neurodevelopmental disorders are there. Cluster includes those disorders whose core features are neurodevelopmental. During developmental period, nothing much. Mental retardation is now redefined as intellectual disorders of IDD, DID. Because normal intelligence is defined as a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. So in statistics, 2 standard deviation below the mean, meaning 70 and less, or less than 70 is considered as mentally retarded or otherwise called disorders of intellectual development. So autism spectrum disorder, deficit in social interactions and communications, restricted repetitive pattern of behavior characterize those things. The language and intellectual functioning, they are likely to exhibit a full range. Neurodevelopmental disorders are of interest to Anil Kumar. Nothing much really by way of those things. Inattentive, hyperactive, impulsive combined. Schizophrenia, the bread and butter of psychiatrists. Schizophrenia is 1 month duration. There are core symptoms, and the first rank symptoms are de-emphasized. Bipolar, for the first time, maybe a person who are not familiar with psychiatry may find it boring. Bipolar 1 disorder and bipolar 2. Initially, such a distinction was not there for ICD, and now it has come. Depressive disorder, the most important is the psychotic symptoms can accompany a moderate depressive episode. Anxiety is now clarified more as a fear-related disorders. There is a fear circuitry in the brain which undergo a lot of development and transformation during the developmental period with a vulnerability to exhibit certain manifestations, and the focus of specific manifestation differ. It starts from generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, agoraphobia, specific phobia, social anxiety disorder, separation anxiety disorder, and selective mutism. because my final presentation is not the thing. Obsessive compulsive or related disorders was initially categorized along with anxiety disorders. This is not the final presentation. Obsessive compulsive disorder, body dysmorphic disorder, olfactory, because there are evidences in the literature coming after 1994 that it is largely a neurologically based disorder. There is a fronto-striato-thalamo-frontal circuit abnormality, and that is basically responsible, which none of the other anxiety disorders share with. And there are a couple of disorders like body dysmorphic disorder, olfactory reference disorder is a new name, hypochondriasis, hoarding disorder, and a body-focused repetitive behavior. The most important thing in all the initial 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is it can present with fair to good or poor to absent insight. Meaning, a person with a body dysmorphic disorder feels that my nose is distorted. When he loses his insight, he thinks, he believes of a delusional nature that my nose is distorted. You cannot convince him otherwise. What will you otherwise? You make a diagnosis that it is a delusional disorder. Here, it is not a delusional disorder. It is an obsessive compulsive disorder because it all started with obsession, and whenever a person experiences a thing, our brain has an information processing model, and the brain concludes, oh, well, it is my obsession, it's my own thought, it's producing anxiety. And gradually, like Stockholm syndrome, they identify with all those things and believe for certain after some time that it is a true. It is not a delusional disorder. It is not a primary delusional disorder. It is a obsessive compulsive disorder with poor or absent insight. Disorder specifically associated with stress. That's the only disorder among the ICD where an etiology is provided. Well, the stress is, even though stress must be there, it is neither sufficient or for making a diagnosis. The person experienced stress because of the diathesis may or may not develop this disorder. The other disorders are well known. There is a complex PTSD. Complex PTSD means along with the PTSD, I need not have to tell you about the PTSD and all, it takes a lot of time. Complex PTSD means along with the PTSD, the person has three characteristics like a difficulty in mood regulation. They feel excessively depressed, always depressed, and their self-worth will be poor. They will be feeling guilty, highly suicidal, and they are unable to make a relationship with others. Maybe because they were raped, they were tortured. That will leave a scar in them, which they find it difficult to regulate their mood, regulate the interpersonal relationship, and will have a serious damage, burn on their self-esteem. Prolonged grief disorder, well, a person dies, usually it's culturally bound. Some people will grieve for a month, sometimes 2 months, and it depends on the culture. If the person continuously grieving for the months and years, which is clearly excess of what is a norm for the culture, makes this disorder. Then comes a dissociative disorder. Dissociative disorder means there is a dissociation. Meaning, if there are loosely tied toys, the toys are put in the ground, because of the trauma, the parts gets dissociated. So we usually are closely linked, we are persons with closely tied, linked identity, memory, motor movements. When I talk to you, I know who I am. I am aware about my memory, my motor behavior, all those things are there. But if there is a stress taking place, it's likely to get dissociated. That's called a dissociation disorder. Dissociation becomes, that includes cognitive symptoms like memory. I may be unaware of those memories and those. A partial dissociative identity disorder, that is a special disorder, which means usually what happens in dissociative identity disorder, Amma and mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. So many non-Malayalis are listening. So, daughter-in-law who cannot be assertive or arrogant towards mother-in-law, occasionally at the height of the stress, she will be possessed. She believes she will be possessed by a devil and try to hit the mother-in-law. So they do it. And at that time, they are actually a devil and not the old, pure, humble daughter-in-law. Partial dissociative identity disorder means always this daughter-in-law will keep the identity, the dominant identity will remain. Periodically, she becomes amnestic. Periodically, some other person also comes in, and periodically some person drives her to do certain things, and that is called a partial dissociative identity disorder. I believe in most of our cases, a partial dissociative identity disorder occurs. Bodily distress disorder is our somatoform disorder, somatic symptom disorder in DSM-5. Another disorder, I don't know, the body integrity dysphoria. The person becomes dysphoric when he knows that he has a normal, intact body. He always wants his body to be abnormal and physically disabled in a way or other. In my experience, I have never seen. Substance use or addictive behavior also in three things. One is a single episode of harmful substance use. Suppose I drink, I fight with other person, or I kick my wife, which in my case is impossible. So that is a single harmful use. That is a codable disorder. A substance use disorder, a harmful use and dependence is a repeated pattern and can be a substance induced disorder as well. Thing is a single episode of harmful substance use. Harm to the health of others resulting from behavior during substance intoxication. Meaning if I drive intoxicated, that also counts as a single episode of harmful substance use. Other addictive behaviors are gambling disorders and gaming disorders. Impulse control disorders are pyromania, kleptomania, compulsive sexual behavior disorder, intermittent explosive disorders. This has made a revolutionary change in ICD-11. Now ICD-11 says you should make a diagnosis of personality disorder, that is all. Problems in functioning of the aspects of the self or interpersonal dysfunction. The self and the interpersonal. Self by way of our self-esteem, self-direction. Interpersonal by way of intimacy or empathy. These are the four dimensions which are required to make a diagnosis of personality disorder. It must be present continuously. Onset usually is in the childhood but not emphasized. It can occur in aged population because the research says such a things are there. For want of time, I am not going into the why these changes occur. And the person, the primary care, the person with people presenting with physical illness to a physician, up to 50% has a personality disorder, which is not diagnosed in the primary care setting, which is not diagnosed by cardiologists, which are not diagnosed by surgeons, which are not diagnosed by obstetricians and gynecologists. Because altogether 89 criteria are there in DSM-5. I myself don't know. I don't remember all these criteria. But a person is taught to identify a personality disorder, make a diagnosis of a personality. If it is severe, mild or moderate, that also a primary care physician can do. Commonly I say, if a person causes you a headache, think that the other person has a personality disorder. Make it mild, moderate and severe, which will address the personality disorder across countries, across specialists, across healthcare workers. The personality disorder needs to be identified because the presence of personality disorder is the most important impediment in the treatment of any disorders, be it psychiatric, be it physical. And then the primary care physician's duty is over. Now coming to the specialist, there are to be put as 6 domains. Only 5 are mentioned. That's why I was searching for the newer things. A negative affectivity, detachment, disinhibition, dissocial, anancastia and borderline. So there are 25 traits altogether. So your duty is to measure the domains, and it keeps on changing. It's subject to treatment effect. Don't take a nihilistic attitude. Draw this 5 domains, 25 traits, and they continuously change. And our intention must be to change them, rather than, because many of the personality disorder are having high comorbidity. A person with a narcissistic will have histrionic traits, borderline traits and so many things. Here, there is no such things. People are put as personality disorder, mild, moderate, severe, with domain effect, with a trait characteristics. Some do not fall under the full criteria. They are put as personality difficulty. The 5-factor model just taken to DSM-5 and finally to ICD-11 is now the dissocial has come. There is no separate code for fetishism, transvesticism, masochism. And the neurocognitive disorder is delirium, mild neurocognitive disorder and amnestic disorder. Interestingly, what is missing? Dementia is missing, or major neurocognitive disorder is missing. These are acquired rather than developmental. Delirium, mild neurocognitive disorder and amnestic disorder. Now the dementia is an entirely different chapter. The name has been retained as dementia, whereas in DSM it has been thrown away, and the major neurocognitive disorder is the new name for previous dementia. But ICD people has preferred to keep the term dementia. Impairment in 2 or more cognitive domains are needed. For DSM, there is only 1 cognitive domain is needed. There is a code for behavior and psychological disturbances in dementia. For the first time, mental and behavior disorders associated with pregnancy, childbirth and puerperia, with or without psychotic features, has been introduced. This is a newer thing. Secondary mental and behavior syndromes associated with the disorders disease classified elsewhere, previously called as organic. This is an organic neurodevelopmental, organic psychotic, organic mood, organic anxiety, because this is now considered as a retrogressive step. Psychotic disorders are all organic. As organic as hyperthyroidism or hypothyroidism or ICSOL. That is a conception. That was the concept. And the distinction between organic and functional is redundant. Because we are searching for the brain abnormalities in persons with or without this disorder. Likewise, distinguishing it as organic, it gets a feeling that mental disorders are functional. No brain abnormality exists, the research. So people consider it, but for practical reason, the clinical utility, a person coming with depression due to intracranial space occupying lesion must be distinguished from major depressive disorder. The clinical utility counts more. So we have all the coding. 6A20.00 is schizophrenia, first episode, current episode symptomatic. There is a code for symptomatic manifestation of primary psychotic disorder. That slide I missed. It can be depressive, it can be cognitive, it can be different psychotic things. So the person with depression has 6A25 symptomatic manifestation presenting as depressive symptoms in primary psychotic disorder. Why? Because the patient developed a cancer. The code for this schizophrenia with prominent depressive symptoms are, now the person has a malignant neoplasm of the bronchus of the lung, unspecified, which is 2C 25.Z. This codes for right lung, bronchus and lung, adenoma, adenocarcinoma, malignant. So this schizophrenic patient with schizophrenia developing a neoplasm of the right side of the bronchus. Right bronchus must carry a cluster coding. Put it in that color. I'm color blind. What is that color? Maroon. That is a coding. So all disorders are codable now. So want of time, I am not going into the details of schizophrenia, bipolar, manic, neurocognitive disorders. Well, advantage of ICD-11 is it is scientifically updated. They claim improved usability in with more clinical details with less training is needed. Making a diagnosis of personality disorder is quite easy. For me also, it's very difficult to make a diagnosis of personality disorder using DSM-5 criteria. Enable coding of all clinical details. Whether the person has tinea vesicle or whatever be, they can be coded. E-health friendly, that is why Jayan is interested. Easily harmonizable. Multilingual support, translation and output. With Malayalam, I don't know. So with anything, yes. Argumentative Indian, always there will be criticism. ICD-10, different versions, everything distilled to a single MMS. No research criteria. The criteria is gone. That's a new slide because this is an old slide. Bye-bye. There is no operationalized criteria. This is not for research. WHO's purpose is not to, and in fact WHO has not done any research, primary original research, it is not their duty. It is their canvas is very big. The third world countries, the poor countries, terrorism, torture, atrocities against women, human rights, children, disability of mental persons with mental disorders and all. Those are the treatment must reach out to them, whether they are in Africa or India or Indonesia or where. So we had an expectation like LDF verum ellam shiriyakum, where we had all the criteria. We were waiting for ICD-11 with so many operationalized criteria, even laboratory evidences, endophenotype, whatnot. All those things were system has now recognized that I am taking a lot of time, but the expectation is based on brief description. We are going back to the old brief description of our grandma telling short stories and the diagnostic guidelines as opposed to the operational diagnostic criteria in DSM-5 or even ICD-10 had some, and DCR had some criteria. But it is congruent with the clinical process. That's what actually we see when we see a patient with depressed. When asked why you are depressed, well, the PGs will start counting all the criteria and say that. No, the clinician, the characteristic of the patient meets with the template the clinician has in his mind. The ICD has to take into consideration the human rights aspect, the scientists doing all the molecular genetics research and all those things. They have to combine all those things, and their primary aim is the global mental health. The reliability is definitely less because there is no criteria. I am going back to the early 80s of my postgraduates. The validity always is questionable. Is this a retrogressive classification? No research evidence, no lab evidences, nothing is mentioned, only a grandma's short story. But the clinical utility is excellent. The ASHA worker, the ANM, from that to Anil Kumar, they can use it with ease and a high rate of inter-rater reliability. The goals of WHO are global. Treatment and research gap is troubling them. Need for other professionals and non-professionals must be brought in, making a diagnosis. The violence, aggression, discrimination must be addressed. The mental health of the vulnerable population like women, children, and the disabled. Not only with that, the Giants SNOMED CT, it has got a high degree of correlation. It's easy to do it. SNOMED CT has 3 lakhs clinical terms, I believe. And all those things, it's very much harmonizable with all those things. E-health friendly. The future, well, at one point of time, we have to address the third world countries, the mental health of the poor world, the research gap must be addressed, the treatment gap must be addressed. But the future, the science laboratories which Anil Kumar holds will throw new lights and all. And we are ready to receive whatever the basic science, the groundbreaking research provide us. Till that time, we ICD people believe we will go with the current classification, which has got high degree of clinical utility. This week, 2 things are taking place. One is the Schizophrenia week. The second is this week in Geneva, the ICD is being, the WHO committee is now approving, endorsing. All the nations, all the 194 nations are sitting in Geneva trying to endorse this ICD level. Thank you.